Good afternoon. Too loud?
Somebody has to take this on. We'll give it to the
Yeah.
junior novelist. It's fine.
This is not going to be the easiest of sessions for all of you, but I'm glad we have two young writers here. Yeah. We have
Not
an
really
exclusive book launch. The book is called No Place to Call My Own. We have Alina Gufran in conversation with Oshin Shiva. I'll give a brief introduction, but I'm sure both of them will add on to that. Alina is a fiction writer and poet who writes about urban alienation and female identity. Based out of Mumbai, she's an alumna of the 2019 Dam Pakht writing workshop, and her work has appeared in some of the best magazines, Himal, The Swaddle, etc., around the globe. Oshin Shiva is a multidisciplinary artist from Tiruvannamalai, based in Goa. Through the lens of surrealism, speculative fiction, and science fiction, and rooted in their Dalit and Tamil heritage, Oshin Shiva imagines new worlds of decolonized dreamscapes, futuristic oases with mutants and monsters, and narratives of queer and feminine power. They work in a variety of mediums, including immersive media, installation, performance art, public art, and digital illustration. They have also been widely published and awarded as well. And over to both of you now.
Thank you. Do we talk through the mics?
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for coming, especially during the lunch slot, so we extra appreciate it. And thank you Gautami for the introduction, that was lovely. I have the immense privilege of introducing Alina, who's not only an incredible writer, but is also a very good friend of mine, and had happened to actually create the novel while she was living here a couple of years ago, and that's how we met. So it's kind of wholesome and holistic that I'm able to introduce her work like this. I will also, I guess, start with a little bit of a description of the book itself. The novel is called No Place to Call My Own. It's also available at the bookstore. If you haven't gotten your hands on it already, I would highly recommend grabbing a copy. The novel, interestingly, it's evocative and it's profound and it's very much rooted in the contemporary India, but it defies sort of a singular categorization. It simultaneously touches upon the main character's coming of age. It's also a commentary on gender and class hierarchies, and is essentially an intimate portrayal of a personal transformation. The journey of the main character is also shaped by shifting friendships and experiences with romantic entanglements, love and loss in general, and is ultimately, at least in my understanding, rooted in hope, which we can talk about a little bit later. It's also in the backdrop of a lot of tensions within the country as well. The novel touches upon the 2020 Delhi riots, the Me Too movement, which is translated as tensions within the characters themselves. And the root of the novel for me, which was the most interesting, was the main character's friendship with her best friend, Medha. Rather than sort of presenting it as an idealized or like a static relationship, what was like touching for me was the complexity that's being translated. They go through a lot of conflict and estrangement and connection and reconciliation, but also a lot of like tensions within themselves throughout the novel, which I think sort of parallels the growth of the main character as well. But anyway, I think I've blabbered on enough. We will hear from the author herself. I wanted to start the conversation with just what was interesting for me. One aspect of it, obviously, which is that the character, you're so good at creating multifaceted characters, which translates to the main character, Sophia, as well. And I did just wanted to, was hoping you'd elaborate a little bit more on sort of this ambivalent relationship with her best friend and how you've kind of captured the nuances of female friendship and what it means to sort of embody this in like the contemporary times that we are, the novel is based in.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, and thanks everyone for coming. I guess I'll just get right into it. I think at the heart of the story, because the backdrop is often so political, fragmented, and there's a certain sense of like a fragmented consciousness that props the novel. Somewhere at the center of it, I wanted a story that was pure heart. Mm-hmm. And just upon reflection and going deeper into my character, I realized that in some way, the only thing that really props her up, because she has a tenuous relationship with her family, which is again reflected in a certain political climate in the country, and so on, is another woman who she happens to be in the same space with. Mm-hmm. So, for starters, they're both on a very similar journey. It of course helps that they're of the same age, so they're experiencing things in a similar fashion. And for lack of a better word, I suppose it makes sense that they're both also contending with where they're situated in society. As such, her best friend's a queer artist. She's trying to be a fine artist in the capital, and that comes with its own sort of trials and limitations. The friendship did not present itself to me when I first started writing the story. It was more of something in the background. And as it went on, in some ways, I realized that their journeys had started reflecting each other, especially politically and personally as well, and artistically, of course. And in some way, it kind of spoke to the title as well, because for me, trying to find the sense of belonging for the narrator was something that emerged as I wrote the novel. It was not, And that's kind of how this complicated friendship developed. Often mirroring real life, I suppose. Because connection is, like you said, not static, and it's quite fluid.
Yeah. I guess that sort of leads into... hello? Is this on? No.
Should I ask it?
Do you want to use this until then?
Yeah. Thank you. No worries. Yeah. Thank you for that answer. I was just wondering, along those lines, when I mentioned that the novel sort of touches upon multiple issues that we're going through as a country, but also as like a character herself, right? I was wondering if you wanted to sort of elaborate on your thoughts on how systemic structures that are prevalent in our everyday lives and what the character is going through as well, right? Like intergenerational trauma, religious tensions, obviously, and gendered sort of vulnerabilities. How do they reflect in the character's journey, but also does that, how is that coming through? Right? Like, is it true? Like, she seems sort of anxious and perpetually trying to spatially situate herself, but also find her way, which harkens back to the name of the novel as well, right? So I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the title and also her, like, how she's sort of figuring out her positionality, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the title of the novel kind of begets this question, and I've been asked this a few times, and I feel like every time I answer it, it sort of shapes itself. I don't think there is a very clear answer to this, but there is one thing that you touched upon, which also I feel became the kind of propulsion for the novel, which is that it is narrated in first person and you're kind of just deeply situated in her mind. And she's also a bit of an unreliable narrator. So often what is happening and what she is telling us is happening is at odds. But to me, that often reflected the tension that she feels with the rest of the world, right? So there is definitely this sort of young arrogance at not wanting to accept circumstances. Sometimes it's bravado that kind of leads you into corners where you make mistakes, but you're too young and egoistic to really accept that. And perhaps sometimes you don't have that self-awareness. I feel like all of this is quite sort of telling of that particular decade of your 20s. For me, this particular character, Sophia, also does possess a certain kind of self-awareness, which I feel is reflective of this world that we live in, where we're so plugged into social media, where everyone's a thought leader and everything's sort of a stand or a take. And I think she very much embodies that. But I think that self-awareness can also sometimes be quite performative. And so in between that dance of performing for others and trying to truly get closer to who she is where the gaps or the chaos lies. And for me, a lot of tension in the narrative came from that, which became quite fun to explore as a writer.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And you can, I mean, I'm glad that you touched upon the structure and the writing style of the novel as well, which was one of the other things that was quite striking to me. Apart from the content and the context itself, just stylistically, it's interesting, right? It's not like any other sort of novels that I'm used to that are more or less chronological or have, I mean, clearly I'm not from the writing space, so I don't really know, but what stood out to me was the style itself. Like, do you want to maybe talk about how she sort of jumps space and time, and it's seemingly sort of fragmented and erratic in a way in terms of like being a narrator, right? So is this reflective of her mindset, or is it reflective of like a larger atmosphere that she's embedded in? Like, would you like to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I just feel that in so many ways, I mean, for starters, you're kind of in her head, right? You're sort of constantly with her interiority. There is very little space or distance from the narrator. So from a strictly sort of technical point of view, it made sense to follow the narrative like that. But I think somewhere the thought process behind that was just a fragmentation of consciousness and how deeply embedded social media is. I mean, this is a personal kind of anecdote, but I'm guessing all of us got into social media when we were about 14, and now we're in some 30s, I suppose. And I think we underestimate, and I feel like language cannot fully grasp yet what social media has done to consciousness, where we're so used to kind of switching from, I don't know, a reel about Palestine to, you know, someone selling you socks to, it's a very absurd way to live, and I just don't think any generation lived this way before. Gen Z was kind of born into it, but the millennial dilemma is peculiar because our childhoods were not beset by this. So we do have a memory of this analogous age, right?
Foregone era.
Yeah, exactly. But even though being online is not at the center or very explicitly spelled out in the novel, I think it is a constant refrain. It's sort of a matrix that she's just plugged into, and everyone around her is plugged into. So even when I may not be talking about it directly, or the narrator is not addressing it directly, it hangs in the background like a bit of a specter. And that fragmentation of consciousness I wanted to capture in the narrative style itself. I think just in terms of the fact that each chapter is set in a different city, in some way became just a tool to manipulate time. In retrospect, would I have written a book that's maybe set over a night? Yes, maybe next time, but you know, debut novelist. So there was this burning desire to condense a decade into a story. What does that look like, you know? Without being literal about it. And I think this structure, that's when it emerged to me, where I was like, would I be able to set her personal experience against what's happening in every city that she finds herself in? And because of the nature of those cities and the nature of sort of late stage capitalism, urban life in general, there are certain themes, overlapping themes that start emerging across, let's say, like a Dubai, Beirut, and Delhi. Also because of her positionality of being a like Indian Muslim woman in the current day and age. And then those themes became more interesting to explore, and the places became incidental. I also just feel that when you're, or at least I'll speak for myself, when I was in my 20s, I was a very porous person. I was constantly impacted by what was happening around me. I suppose that's a bit of an artistic disposition as well. And in that, writing place and writing the cities into the story became sort of a very interesting challenge, because they were characters unto themselves. And who she is, because so much of her is about fitting in and trying to find that belonging and then ultimately rejecting it. But initially, at least, that she's very good at morphing and becoming a chameleon. And I think as women, minority women, although I don't particularly like using that word, we are quite used to that dance of trying to fit into certain spaces, right? So I just wanted to capture that reality, I suppose.
Yeah, completely. And it's very relatable and very well fleshed out in her journey. There are a couple of interesting things that you brought up that I want to touch upon as well. I do want to expand a little bit on the structure of the book itself. The intention behind, I mean, you did touch upon it a little bit, the intention behind dividing it into these cities, right? Like, to what extent does her journey influenced by the time of her life, and also how she's absorbed or is morphing into these specific cities, right? I also, in general, want to sort of touch upon the trajectory of the novel itself, because there is quite an evident shift somewhere in between, where she's going through sort of her relationship, her contentious relationship with her parents, and then her other relationships with friends and herself. But throughout, somewhere through the middle of the novel, you can see her contending with how to engage with like social political issues, right? Or just how she is being perceived by others, whether or not she wants to be seen in a certain way. Which is very sort of unique to the novel itself. Do you want to maybe touch upon that?
I think what happens, I suppose, sort of is that's, I'll talk about the story for a second, then I'll kind of relate it to a more lived experience perhaps. That for the narrator, because she essentially kind of grows up, you know, she's in Beirut and she's in Dubai, and these are, for lack of a better word, Muslim majoritarian countries. This idea of being Muslim is an aside. It's not something you wake up and think about when you look in the mirror. And with the shift in the country, although because she is the product of an interfaith Hindu-Muslim marriage, her parents are Hindu and Muslim, this consciousness of awakening to a certain socio-political identity is not something that happens of its own accord. It is a result of perception, it is a result of slotted into certain brackets, good and the bad. I have to say, there are it's sort of a result of like how others perceive her. So it is very much that sort of idea of looking versus being looked at, how you look at yourself and how others look at you, and then you start believing that. And again, I feel like that ties into certain gender conversations and the idea of what it means to be a woman and the roles you kind of have to play perhaps when you're a woman. So I think somewhere that became an important thing for me to touch upon, that the fact that consciousness comes, the tonal shift you talk about comes a bit later in the novel. and is reflected in her contending with her childhood and the disintegration of her parents' marriage, which is then clearly being reflected in what's happening in the country. And I think one of the big revelations she has, I don't know if this is giving too much away, is I suppose that that perhaps these biases and prejudices always existed, despite our liberal, leanings and our beliefs. I suppose when you're at the other end of being looked at, your notions of these things are a bit different. Part of the reason why I wanted this consciousness to kick in a bit later in the novel, apart from, of course, like certain technical circumstances, was that, it's just not something that, being Muslim is not kind of a job that she performs. In the beginning, she's just more concerned with the business of being and kind of existing as a 20-something in this mad world, sort of a thing. So yeah, that was the thinking behind it.
Yeah, as you go through the journey, you can, you're very much attached to the character. It's just made so well that you feel like you're going through the journey with her. I mean, yeah. That's just stating the obvious, but speaking of sort of her relationships with different characters, it is interesting that there are, like, deliberately numerous men who make sort of fleeting or transient appearance in the main character's life, right? And also, I guess, due to the sheer volume of the deluge of men that you have embedded in the novel, there is obviously only a certain extent to which you can sort of imbibe them with complexity. I just wanted to sort of wanted you to kind of expand upon the choice and how that was like an important dichotomy or an important balance for you to sort of achieve in the novel.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, actually. I just, I think the male characters are perhaps a bit more ornamental. I would say the only two slightly nuanced relationships that she has with men in the novel is her father and her sort of more long-term partner, I suppose. But I think more than my approach as an author to this particular way of approaching it was, I would not give that precedence over Sophia's thing. I just feel like the more I plugged the character, the deeper I went into the character, I realized that this is how she sees them. She kind of sees them as ornaments. And frankly, it was also so fun to write them as ornaments. And I suppose, somewhere I just made that choice when I'm like, I'm going to stick to her perception of, because she is a lot more biting and a little unforgiving with men. She'll notice certain things about them that she would be far more forgiving with women around her for reasons sort of, which are perhaps not explained but implicit. And beyond a point, I was like, okay, this is a fun little exercise where I could, flip this around and have very ornamental male characters, perhaps. Yeah.
No, definitely. It is an interesting device or tool that you've used. I guess I'm just trying to understand like how it reflects onto her like self-actualizing, and also it in interesting ways is attached to implicitly and explicitly to her like growth and self-worth to a certain extent, right? She's kind of reflecting conflict in general with dating culture or just relationships with men. And also, I mean, my take on it was that she's getting more and more into realizing and exploring her bodily autonomy, right? And agency as like a woman or a character, right? So that was interesting for me. Yeah. I just wanted to maybe in a broader sense touch upon how the protagonist and in turn your intentions were to make the character sort of embody personal growth through conflict. Would I be correct in like analyzing it in this sort of structure? And also, what does that mean in relation to different things, in relation to other characters, in relation to societal expectations, right? Like institutions like family and religion, and her entering into the workforce, and hence, I guess, capitalism, and her graduation from the university. Like, what was sort of, what is it that you want to portray? Like, I guess I'm asking, do you see conflict as generative or as like a plot device through which you can sort of use it as a prism to explore her journey?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't think there was any active thought behind imbuing the story with conflict. It wasn't like, oh, this is a particular scene I want to write and I'm going to put conflict at the center of it. I think it was more about understanding, like I said before, the character, because the contradictions with the character and how she contends with the world is where the tension really lies. So, like, let's say there's a particular situation that could move along in a very smooth manner, but because of her own tensions and her own internal contradictions, wherein she may be playing a certain role but she's not comfortable with it. She may have to bite her tongue in a certain scenario because it'll benefit her career, but it is not what she really wants. And it's those moments which we, like all of us, go through like 80 times a day, is where the sense of conflict comes from. This also reminds me of, like, in film school, my screenwriting professor would really just say this a lot, where he'd be like, there's no scene without conflict. But I don't think it's a very external sense. It can be externalized, of course, as it must be, but I think truly it just comes from within the character in some way. And I feel like have I answered your question?
Yeah, that makes sense. Good job. One of the main, maybe we shouldn't even like phrase it as such, but one of the tensions within the novel is her relationship with her parents and their parents' relationship within themselves, and how you very smartly sort of mirrored or used that as a microcosm to what's happening in Delhi, or within what the backdrop is to her life, right? And what was interesting for me and is relatable to me and possibly other people in the audience and also our friends is this tendency for our parents' generation especially to have sort of an increased sense of religiosity as they grow older. Is it something that you had experienced yourself, or how, like, I guess I'm trying to understand how you have sort of used this tension within the parents to illuminate on like a larger issue at hand.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's where the major kind of tonal shift happens in the novel, and it is sort of, which is why I think it's being called a coming of age, and it very much is a coming of age, but that for me always has connoted a loss of innocence. So as wonderful as it can be, I think it does come with certain grieving and a certain sense of loss. This particular moment of the parents' marriage, interfaith marriage I might add, because everyone does view it like that, disintegrating is extremely pivotal, and I would say reflected in what's happening in the country overall. And I think what happens is that, as she mentions in the book, her parents got married against the backdrop of Babri Masjid demolition. They're from UP, it's a family from Uttar Pradesh, when that marriage kind of disintegrates, it's reflected in further polarization in the country. The one realization she does have is that I know a lot of like liberals, let's say in the capital, are shaking because they feel that, oh, this is so sudden, we didn't see this coming. But she's like, I've grown up in this tension, and
It's
this
a
is
cyclical
the
pattern.
quagmire I've grown up in. So I've actually been turned to it since I was a child. And yeah, it just becomes such a parallel. Quite often you see what happens in the family, you can see it happen at a national register as well, politically. I think for the character, the parents reverting to their respective religions after they've come together as a familial unit just provides, I suppose, a sense of security, right? Because the familial unit has fallen away. So what identity do you revert to? And in this case, if you are reverting to your, original identity, so to speak, of which comes with a certain, community backing and a religious backing, and that is being reflected and constantly supported by the messaging happening at a national register, then you're inclined to just sort of believe that. So it's frankly, I feel a certain weakness and a vulnerability that we see exploited and played on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. I also, I guess, wonder as to what extent accessibility has played a part, to what extent has sort of children moving away from homes and this, at least in my case, this sort of gap that exists within after you sort of retire and you have time in your hands, and everyone's a student of WhatsApp University, like to what extent has social media played a part, to what extent has media in general played a part, in exacerbating or increasing, or I could be wrong, maybe it's just always existed and it's just maybe more prevalent at the moment.
It's
Yeah, I think, needless to say, big tech and sort of social media has really played a very pivotal part in polarization of dialogue and discourse. At the same time, it has provided access to, I suppose, a lot of media that we wouldn't generally be exposed to. So, like most things that play out at such a large scale, it's a double-edged sword. That being said, I do think for the character and the narrator herself, growing up, she is able to notice certain prejudices or biases that always existed in people's minds. Perhaps they were discussed in whispers in bedrooms. I suppose the only legitimacy that kind of came about, and I will say in a very big way after 2014, was that you could just wear it as a badge of honor. You no longer had to whisper it. And it sounds like perhaps what could be the fallout of that, but I suppose in so many ways we are seeing the fallout of that, and it kind of deepens a sense of otherization. It changes the way you look at yourself, and that's her, that's at the center of her search and the center of her kind of dilemma, because she actually is now consigned to a community that she feels frankly quite alienated from. And that's also a very sort of truthful thing to explore for a person, because I have been quite often turned to narratives where the minority body is always just a site of spectacle. Things are always happening to them, and as important that is to perhaps witness, it's not a monolith. That's not the only thing that you kind of go through as a Muslim person in the world.
Very fair.
Yeah.
And I go through that myself as well,
Yeah,
so it's very much
exactly.
relatable. The core idea of what you just spoke about is kind of leading into my next question, and I think I will try to maybe wrap up the questioning, and you can do a little bit of reading, and we'll open it up to the audience for some questions. Hi. In sort of a general, overall, overarching terms, I wanted to know or get your thoughts on what do you think is sort of at stake as an author in contemporary India? I know it's a little bit vague, but you can take it in whatever direction that you want to go in.
Yeah.
Just thinking along the lines of author versus like authority, thinking along the lines of the personal is political. Do you have, or what do you think is sort of the obligation or intentions that someone who is releasing a novel that's going to be read by the masses should, or you would want to embody or tackle, grapple with?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, far be it for me to tell anyone what they should or should not be writing, of course. But that being said, it's just an interesting time, I think, to be an artist in the country currently. I'm not a journalist, I'm not an activist. I feel like the work they do is far riskier. Their bodies, their sort of minds, their livelihoods are on the line far more than artists in so many ways. I do think artists can hide in certain spaces behind satire, behind the veil of fiction. And as much as that's hiding, it's also kind of the ultimate interrogation of the truth, and a certain, perhaps, in so many ways, a larger spiritual truth as well. Personally, I don't actively believe in an obligation to tell a certain kind of story, because I feel like as long as there are enough platforms that are willing to kind of put forth a lot of different kind of narratives, that would be best, because it would be too idealistic and naive to be like, oh, that's propaganda. Like, I just don't think that works anymore, so I feel like I wouldn't be able to comment on that. We're too deep in that world. But I think as a response to that, if there's enough people, and I think there is, I think publishing today in India is a very strong example of that, platforming enough voices, especially not just from urban centers, but also kind of more what's happening at the regional register. I think that could be perhaps cumulatively a strong answer to propaganda.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to round off this conversation with a couple of maybe fast, rapid fire, fire questions. You can expand upon it as much as you like,
Sure.
or not, which is fine as well. Just basic questions like, who are your inspirations? In the larger sense as a writer, but also for this book specifically. And what would you sort of want the readers to take away, if you, as I guess like an essence of the book, if you were to be able to make it?
Yeah. In terms of influences, to be honest, I don't think there was like one singular book that directly inspired this particular story. I can tell you perhaps a collection I was returning to while I was writing it, and this it took a while to write this. There's of course, I mean, Avni Doshi's Burnt Sugar had a profound effect on me, because just the way she explores the tenuous nature of motherhood, unflinchingly, no apologies, was exciting to me. And my narrator also has a sort of tenuous relationship with her mother. A couple of other authors I was returning to and reading quite a bit were, I'll rapid fire answer this. Mary Gateskill, Annie Ernaux, Clarice Lispector, of course, one of the greats. And these two Italian writers I'm obsessed with, actually, since I was a teenager, Alberto Moravia and Domenico Starnone, who's also a screenwriter, but I think these two in particular are masters of trying to plug the psychological depths of the human condition, if I may. Yeah.
And what would you like the readers to sort of
Take away.
retain, take away? I mean, one must retain the whole book, obviously, but sort of the feeling that you want to leave them with.
Yeah, I think you sort of touched upon this in the beginning, and I don't think there's going to be any one particular thing that I would want anyone to take away. I think a lot of reading can be such a private kind of sacred practice. I think everyone who engages with it will have their own relationship with it. I hope, even if it's a bad one, that's exciting to me to see how people engage with it. Yeah, I don't think there is one thing actually, so I don't think I can answer that.
I mean, that is an answer already. That's good.
Yeah.
We will let Alina read
Yeah, sure.
a chapter, whichever one that you would like.
Yeah, sure.
And then we will throw it out for questions to the audience.
She loves that. Out.
Okay. So it's happened. No, that's not quite right. It's been happening. It's been building up slowly and steadily, and now finally, with a resounding force, the constructs of what I, as a privileged Indian, know to be safe, familiar, and real have collapsed. Despite my education, access, and partial NRI advantages, even my half Hindu lineage, I have been reduced to what my last name denotes. I think of how having to build a life outside the country has robbed my father of a sense of rootedness, an ability to call one place his own. He's postponed his retirement because he's not sure how to return to today's India. The colony he grew up in now has houses marked with saffron flags and routine morchas taken out by men frothing at the mouth with chants of Hindu Khatre mein hai, Jai Shri Ram, and Mandir yahi banega, the war cries of a lost generation. I sit on the floor in the middle of the new apartment I've recently leased at a highly subsidized rate from a friend's family. Cardboard boxes pile up around me, taped and marked with labels. Books, clothes, kitchen stuff, medical reports, electronics. The apartment's situated in an old building with paint peeling from its walls and a smelly, narrow staircase. But it's on the 4th floor and faces the east, allowing sunlight to filter through rows of buildings. At night, a hush falls over the street, giving me space and time to reassemble my life after the spectacular failures of the last few years. I lie on the single mattress on one end of the room with a lone lamp by its head. A steady quiet permeates the house, even though I can hear the footsteps of the neighbors upstairs. Next to it are some planks of plywood I plan to use to build a bookshelf, a 2-burner stove not plugged in yet, some brightly colored bed sheets Ma sent across with matching pillowcases, the expensive film textbooks from Prague that I haven't opened in a few years, and Polaroids neatly contained in Ziploc bags. The only thing I've figured out in the last few weeks is the Wi-Fi, the green buttons blinking in the night like fireflies. I take a few books, create a makeshift desk, and prop the laptop on it. I click on trending hashtags populated by the ruling party's IT cell, paid to troll on social media and scan doctored videos and smears of saffron across profile pictures, a digital collage of hatred. Social media channels like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram only echo my thoughts back to me, and yet I cannot look away. I've always had a confusing history, an Arya Samaji Hindu mother and a Sunni Muslim father. They met at his older brother's wedding in Lucknow, and my father immediately fell in love. They both stay in Kanpur in the 1980s. Ma lived in Gulista Colony, a predominantly upper-middle-class Hindu settlement. My father, the second of 7 siblings, held a menial job as a warehouse manager, the only employment his bachelor's degree from Kanpur University earned him. They both defied several societal norms to move to Delhi, where they got a home together in South Extension, an upcoming part of the city not yet hemmed in by jewelry stores and fancy clothing showrooms. A Muslim man and a Hindu woman living together before they got married. It was practically unheard of, but their reality nonetheless. Rooting through my boxes, I find a wooden photo frame with my parents' photo encased in it, and the words, "Love Jihad," echo in my brain. Today, it might be impossible, even illegal, what was once just difficult. Nanaji was a judge with the Lucknow High Court, and Dadajan worked in the railways. Ma and her younger sister, true to their Banya roots, studied at AMU and IIMs and were expected to hold down corporate jobs that would ensure a comfortable life. Nani was a Sanskrit PhD scholar, whereas Dadi was married at the age of 14. After her death, they found 70,000 rupees hidden neatly in the folds of her crisp cotton saris, the only material remnants of her legacy. Ma's English was slick. They had a television at home. She was taught how to play basketball, even if she wasn't allowed to wear jeans outside her home. My father started working at 18 and did considerably well for himself, a mix of charm and street hustle that helped him rise through the ranks. At my parents' wedding reception, nobody from my father's side showed up except his parents, while my mother's father offered him money to not marry her. The grandmothers were perhaps the first to establish any real bond, extending what they knew best, empathy, perhaps because they'd had to exercise so much of it over the years. On Twitter, amateur videos of manic mobs marching down barely lit back alleys surface, the chants of Desh ke gaddaro ko goli maro salo ko, reverberating off bolted windows and padlocked doors. This country hates me. I see tweets about a spontaneous protest at Marine Drive in response to what's happening in Delhi. It's almost midnight, but I decide to take a taxi there. Part of me is relieved that I'm in Bombay, and another part feels like I've betrayed the place where I should be, where the violence is happening. Ever since the protests against the bills began, I've turned up at the Gateway of India and joined people in the chorus of Bella Ciao and Hum Dekhenge, uncertain but spurred by the electricity of the moment. I've watched women in hijabs take the mic and policemen attempt to dismantle protest sites. I've craned my neck to catch a glimpse of student leaders and been taken with their poise and courage in the face of humiliation and distress. Students, activists, leaders from local Muslim parties, and other community members pass biscuits and juice around. Some stand with a look of confusion, of disbelief that things have finally come to this, while others show the way, sing protest anthems, and put their truths across with conviction and a lack of fear. But it disturbs me, this complete lack of fear, knowing that nobody sleeps in tents and braves police lathis and Sangi venom unless they're determined and here to stay. And I know it disturbs them too. The matter of us versus them is a convenient matter, a political tool strategically employed and intensified by the powers that be until it seeps into the subconscious of the country. That's one argument. Another is that bigotry always existed and lurked in nooks and corners, but is now emboldened and being worn as a badge of honor. There are clear camps and we must pick a side. I'm not a practicing Muslim. I can't be immediately identified as one on the street. I don't wear the hijab and have an ambiguous first name, but I'm immediately consigned to a community, handed the generational trauma I may have had some luck escaping.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the beautiful reading. Very evocative and visceral. And once again, please grab the book at the store if you haven't already. And now we'll open up for any questions that the audience may have.
Enjoyed the reading a lot, and I was curious to know, you spoke about the book in, like, the book is there and you are here, kind of. I felt a certain distance between you and the book, and I was curious to know how much of your personal lived experience in any way has influenced the book.
Yeah, I suppose, thank you for that question. I suppose in some ways the distance has become necessary because when you're kind of expounding aspects of who you are, when you're constantly searching for that, there is absolutely no definition to who I might be at the moment. And when you kind of put it out into the world and there's, enough people reading it, that I suppose that distance becomes necessary, A, to preserve my own kind of sense of self, and to B, perhaps have an objective understanding of the work itself. But to answer your question, yes, there are certain aspects of my lived experience that have informed certain circumstances in the book, but, people or events or the actual things that happen are absolutely dramatized because that's just more fun when you're writing fiction, yeah.
Thank you very much for their amazing reading on the book. I haven't read the book. Just from the discussion, I want to know if main character had a Hindu father, had a Muslim mother, do you think the journey would have been different?
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, definitely a hypothetical question, but I suppose if I was to relate it to the very nature of perhaps familial setups, the way we know them today, the fact that we have the last names of our fathers, the family name is often the patriarchal name, I suppose in that case it would be a bit different, and she would be looked at differently, and perhaps she wouldn't feel in certain situations, like let's say at an immigration office, she would feel safe in those situations, and I would be happier for her. But maybe there wouldn't be a story. I don't know.
Thank you.